Hello, my name is Paul Zanazanian, and welcome to History in the Now Conversations, a podcast on history and how we use it in our everyday lives. History in the Now Conversations explores how we use history to know who we are, to know how to think and feel, and to know how to engage in our daily routines. History in the Now Conversations examines what history is, what it does, and how we can use it or even should use it in our everyday lives. Today's guest is Claudia Michell. Claudia is a Distinguished James McGill Professor in the Faculty of Education here at McGill University in Montreal, Canada, where she is the founder and director of the Participatory Cultures Lab. Claudia is also an Honorary Professor at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. Her research focuses on participatory visual and arts-based research, particularly in the context of social justice issues, ranging from youth-focused research on gender-based violence to work with teachers. Our guest is the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Girlhood Studies and Interdisciplinary Journal, and the author, co-editor of numerous books, including her most recent book, Collaborative Methods, Participatory Data Analysis, and Feminist Research, published by the University of Alberta Press in 2025. Her co-editors are Kaylan, Schwarz, and Rebekah, Hutten. Claudia has won numerous awards for her work, including the SSHRC Gold Medal for the impact of her research on young people. SSHRC stands for the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Congratulations. She was also awarded the Léon Guérin Prize du Québec. Congratulations again. And Claudia is also a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Claudia, welcome and thank you for coming today.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Paul. It's such a pleasure to be here. Looking out over the mountain. Thank you.
I'm so excited that you're here today. I thought I'd start off with an icebreaker. And the question I wanted to ask relates to the notion of hope.
Yeah. Okay.
A lot of the work you do deals with negative things like violence and disease and a lot of horrors that the average person in North America would find difficult to deal with. Yet at the same time, there seems to be hope in the work you do. There's this promise of a better tomorrow that seems to come out from everything you do in terms of your research and the journal and the book and so forth. My question is, what kind of responsibility comes with this idea of hope, trying to help people?
Wow, that's a great question. I kind of put it into futures. Well, the present and the futures, which I realize is tricky. I'm talking to a historian who will want me to talk about the past. But I think the whole notion of kind of like gender futures, kind of the notion of equity in futures, also for the now is also really, really important. But so much of the work that I do is with young people who are such visionaries already. And I think there's a real obligation for people who have a social justice bend to them to really think through how can they support young people? How can we support young people to have hope? How can we support young people and their families to think not only of the now and of the future? So I guess it is a really important piece. I'm not a hope scholar as such, and there are people who identify as hope scholars, but I definitely think of myself as a social justice scholar. I think of myself as a future scholar, and I guess I will talk about where this also links to, I guess, feminist pasts, feminist histories as well.
So on the notion of responsibility and feminism, what is feminism? And when you work on feminism, does it come with an added responsibility?
I don't know that I can define feminism, or like feminisms is probably the current thinking. I do a lot of work in Southern Africa where there is a whole group of people who talk about African feminisms and really are thinking through not only the voices of women and empowerment of girls and women, but also thinking of it within particular colonial or attempting to be decolonized areas. So I think that we have to be very broad about what is feminism and feminisms, but definitely issues around equity and equality and voice are very important pieces of that. You had a second part of this question, though.
Yes, I'm curious about the notion of responsibility.
Oh, well, yeah, there is I think probably.
Well, there's this heavy weight, I'm assuming, because you're helping so many people and you're giving hope through your work, that there's a sense of responsibility that comes with it. And I'm trying to understand.
It's a good question. Helping is a tricky question because it has kind of like this notion of, I don't know, perhaps global north, global south, or inequities. And some of the helping, especially if working with young people, is to kind of get out of the way. Helping by maybe making sure that there are support systems or there's fair payment for participants to be part of a project, but not necessarily framing it as helping so much as, I don't know, I guess we could get into semantics around helping and supporting and getting out of the way, but making sure that the way that we're getting out of has a path for young people to actually, achieve something that they want to do, or to at least, I guess coming back to your idea of hope, taking the idea that there is a future for them.
And does that place heavy weight on you in terms of the work you do, or?
Sometimes. Sometimes, obviously we both think about, I know you apply for a lot of funding applications. You're trying to think through, like, what difference could this make to other people? But of course, it also makes a difference to ourselves to be able to do this kind of work. But I think there is responsibility, and we know that whatever funds we're able to get or whatever advocacy we're able to do, it's often very limited. It's often, just in the current context of support to international development, we've just seen massive budget cuts to Global Affairs Canada, massive budget cuts to IDRC. So those are bodies that in the past have made huge differences to young people in terms of health, education, and so on. So the idea that these funds might be drying up, or our federal government is thinking more of economics and less around feminism and equity, are pieces that, like, how do we bring new responsibility to that? And it does weigh, like, obviously as a scholar, I have benefited greatly from this kind of work, but I also hope think that the communities that I work with benefit, but like there is this responsibility and also a responsibility to doctoral students and graduate students. This kind of work takes place because we have doctoral students and graduate students. And if we didn't have funding for them, like how do we continue to support them as well? So I guess it is a bit of there is a huge accountability piece that I think we all think about in different ways.
But also in terms of the impact of your work in helping people who aren't necessarily in academia, that too must factor in quite a bit. I wanted to ask some clarification questions in terms of definitions. Mm-hmm. So the first question I had is, what does girlhood studies mean?
Okay. Well, as the founding editor of Girlhood Studies, I think I was walking through a bookstore in the UK in about 2000 with a couple of my colleagues, Jackie Reed Walsh, who is a scholar now at Penn State, and the late Jackie Kirk, who was a doctoral student at McGill and, as you know, tragically died in Afghanistan in 2008. And we had been talking about some sort of a girls' studies kind of impetus, and we happened to see Girlhood Studies in one little section of a bookstore, and we thought, that's it. That's what we would like to take as the journal and journal name. But prior to that time, obviously there were lots of researchers working around girls and young women, but it was kind of an offshoot of women's studies. And very often even the term girls and women became one word. And yet we know within like childhood studies and youth studies, age and access to resources and power and all of those things are very, very important. And women's studies isn't exactly girlhood studies. And so much of the work that we try to support in the journal is really like participatory work. Let's hear from girls themselves. I think we have tons of research about girls, but not necessarily with girls and for girls. Girlhood studies is also an area that I think really picks up on feminist history, because girlhood studies also has this the sense that people are at a particular point in time in their lives. And so we often do a lot of research around memory work and people looking back on their own lives as girls. So there's a lot of, you'll love this, a lot of history in girlhood studies as kind of a principle that we bring along to this work. So I don't know if I really fully define girlhood studies, but definitely that notion of with girls, for girls, about girls, and kind of bringing forward a really key feature of gender as opposed to children. And also just to say that there is a parallel journal on boyhood studies, which is actually, we have the same publisher, Alberta Press. And I think with the new work on masculinity studies and boyhoods, that's like really, really important. So kind of like hanging on to those two, which allows us to think about the gendered components of growing up and the gendered components of childhood in ways that are, I think, kind of have an advocacy piece that these journals allow that wouldn't happen if we didn't have girlhood studies and boyhood studies.
Very interesting. So it takes place during young girls' adolescence,
yes.
Basically. It's their formative years where they're becoming adults.
Yeah, well, it can also be like little girls. There's really interesting work on, well, obviously I shouldn't say obviously. Nothing is obvious. But all of the work that happens with, even how parents socialize their children as girls or boys. And then the area, the other end of it is also really difficult. Like, is it 18? Is it 21? Is it 24? We're always in these debates when people submit an article to Girlhood Studies.
Wow.
And then it's great if they're about adolescent girls or preteens, but when they're like 26 or 28, we're like, well, are they women? But they're like, there's also kind of the notion of who is a girl, what is a girl, how is a girl,
wow.
and how that's socially defined by, in different cultural contexts and so on too. Very
interesting. My next question is, what is gender-based violence?
The idea of violence against someone because of their gender. And increasingly we're looking at the notion of femicide as like particularly intimate partner violence, where people are being killed entirely because they are women or girls or young women, but also trying to really thinking through what kinds of social contexts would that work take place. And very often it is in family settings, it's in domestic violence and so on. So there's also gender-based violence and sexual harassment situations in universities, and our own university has some really important policies on this. But that's often sort of a sliding scale of from verbal abuse through to acts of extreme violence through to like femicide and
wow.
actual killing.
Wow, yeah. Do you see an evolution in how the violence evolves or progresses over time or moves across time? Or is it hard to, or is it always more or less the same, but on that spectrum you were talking?
It's hard, yeah, it's hard to say. I've been doing this work for a long time, and I always think that things are getting better, and then I realize that they're not. Or there are, like, we know within, like, obviously, like 25 years ago, social media wasn't an issue, whereas now it's a huge issue in terms of how young people are being targeted and so on. So there are new forms of violence, and I think we also become newly aware of forms of violence that we hadn't really thought about, and cultural contexts as we learn more about what does it mean to like honor killings, or how do we think about family structures and so on as well. Yeah. So. It's kind of sometimes hopeless, and sometimes trying to think through how would our government policies help to protect women, but then what new things are we putting in place? Like there's now kind of a femicide observatory for keeping track of crimes, because even the first instance of named sexual harassment was in 1975, which isn't the first time anybody was
No.
harassed,
Yeah.
but somebody started naming it.
Oh, wow.
So then once something is named, then people can start collecting data on it or finding out more about it. And like even in schools not just schools I was going to say schools in South Africa, schools in Canada, what are the levels of harassment and violence that student teachers might experience when they go into a school? And there's just been a very large study done in Ontario on the number of young women, racialized young women, in their stages in student teaching in Ontario schools. And we just haven't done the study in Quebec, but I'm sure it will be similar, that just went unnoticed. Like, oh, a student teacher is maybe not seeming to do so well in that school, or they're quiet about it because there's nowhere to report it. So I think some of this work I've been looking at in Southern Africa for years and years, and like, why have we not looked at this in Canada? But we are now starting to look at it in Canada as well, recognizing that our opportunities for young women are greatly impeded by many patriarchal structures still.
Is there something about girlhood studies, feminism, about the question I just asked, about patriarchy and women's liberation and or equity and justice? Why is it, maybe it's a naive question, but why is it so complex? Why is it hard? Why are we usually walking on eggshells when it comes to discussing some of these issues?
Well, because they are complex. They are like they're legal issues, they're historical issues, they're cultural issues. There's power imbalances, there's economic imbalances, and if we start building in the idea of race, if we build in the notions of non-binary profiles and cultural context, there's just like they're usually not just one thing. And who gets to ask the question, and who gets to answer the question, and who gets to come forward with answers is all part of that. And I think we have been, we do have a long history of patriarchy. We have a long history of white people getting to have the say, or we have a long histories of class structures. So trying to break through all of those at the same time means there's going to be a huge amount of complexity.
So it's really hard to know if there's progress being made or if people's lives are improving for the better.
Yeah, well, there's a whole lot of other things happening at the same time. COVID was a good, bad example. People, I was thinking of young people being disconnected for all that period of time when many of them weren't able to go to school, they weren't able to socialize, play hockey, whatever these things might be, and like the fallout to this work. And so people in my work in South Africa, you might have had some progress in terms of gender-based violence in a community, and then suddenly you have a young woman like locked up in her home, like not able to see anybody, not able to go out, not able to do anything. So that some of the structures that might have been in place in terms of social affinities or being able to meet other women were suddenly then ended, and they were like locked up all day. And their husband or their partner suddenly had a new control over them. There's a whole movement in South Africa during COVID of what kinds of signals could a woman give if somebody called to say that she's being abused? And it's like, oh yes, I do need Tupperware, or like, and these changed all the time because once the code could become known, people had to have something new. But recognizing that some of the progress that took place up to like 2019 or 2020, I should say, was ended, and like the number of girls who left school because they no longer were going to school. Many of them never returned to school because they became pregnant because of all of the kinds of structures in their community. So like sometimes it's like one step forward and two steps back. Perhaps we come into it with a different lens. I think I mentioned to you earlier that there's the observatory in Canada on femicide. So we're starting to look at different forms of violence in a more explicit way. Maybe we're collecting new data or better data. Maybe we can do more of that in schools. Maybe we can, instead of just like who attends school, we ask some other subtle questions about when do people not attend school. So those would be some pieces that we could also think about.
When I listen to you, it pains me to hear of the examples you just mentioned. And that made me think of the initial question of hope and the idea of responsibility. And it's probably what you just said, just being able to gather more data, to be able to do research, and just to get more information out there for people so that people's lives can improve for the better, but all the while knowing that things may evolve differently. And like there's a lot of contingency, it seems like.
And maybe one of the pieces that I think is really important, and going back to your opening, my interest in participatory and arts-based research is a really critical part of this, because we've just worked with about 200 young people in 8 or 9 countries to create photos in a photo voice project called Gender in My Community. And I think you saw the exhibition that came out of it called Youth United Will Never Be Defeated, which was their message of hope that they decided was the title of their exhibition, and they wrote a whole curatorial statement about that. But the exhibition itself is full of photos that really highlight gender-based violence. They highlight female genital mutilation, they highlight trans bashing, a whole range of issues that young people saw in their community. And they wrote captions about them. And this exhibition has traveled to about 8 or 9 countries in South Africa and Southern Africa and Mexico. But we've also we had the exhibition here at McGill. We had an exhibition in the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design. So it's kind of like, how do people look at those photographs? And we looked at some the other night at Concordia, and some people said, well, look, some people are smiling as they are talking about gender-based violence, but they're also reenacting. And there is something about the joy of performance. And people are doing these together. They are drawing attention to the issues, and their captions say that. But they're also, there is something about collectively trying to show people what the issues are and why those are important, which I think is a very hopeful part of something. If people were not hopeful, they would no, I don't want to take any pictures. There's no point in doing this. But if we can kind of say, well, look, let's take pictures. How could we share them in other communities? Who do you want to see these photographs? Which government members should see these photographs? Those are kinds of things that I think do help people think through. Yeah, there is. We do have a government. We do have a Ministry of Education. We do have a Ministry of Health. What could they do? We have teachers. What could they do?
And that arises because through the methodology just described, it gives people a voice.
Yeah. And there is some, I mean, it's fun. It's fun to take photographs. It's fun to make films, making collages or zines. These are pieces that are typically done in group settings, and people talk a lot. They talk about the issues. They talk about but they also talk about their everyday lives and lots of other. They experience tragedy and violence, but they also experience I have a friend who does this, or this is what I'm going to do on Saturday, or maybe it's going to church. There's a whole range of things that people do.
They're living in the now.
And they're living in the now.
And they're doing history in the now.
And they're doing in the history, yes. Yeah.
So before we talk history, I have a couple more questions.
Yes.
And I'm really interested to learn more about your pathway.
Oh.
What led you? What's your quote-unquote life story? What led you over the years to do the research that you do and to be motivated to do the work that you do?
Oh, my gosh. Well, I have long been interested in work on gender. I mean, I suppose it's probably somewhere in my girlhood, but definitely from the first Ms. magazine that came out in 1972, I was one of the first subscribers to this, I think, or maybe it was 1971. I'm really interested in social issues. I kind of come from a back to the land movement, which wasn't necessarily specifically feminist. There was a lot of division of labor in that work, but it was also utopic. a very utopic world, I think, from the 60s and 70s that kind of led me into this work. Once I was doing my doctoral work, I didn't start thinking I was going to work on gender in some way, but I was interviewing people who read a lot. And I ended up discovering that many of the women that I interviewed who were voracious readers would often apologize and say, oh my goodness, well, yes, I do read a lot. I suppose I shouldn't be doing so much reading. I should be doing other things. And then I interviewed men, and they were like, yes, I do read a lot. And I go into my study, or I go off and I love to sit and read. And I was like so blown away by the gender differences and how people experience something so kind of ordinary in the sense of schoolwork and literacy, that it was very gendered. And I think from then on, I had an opportunity. I lived in Prince Edward Island for a number of years, where, like, kind of part of a feminist movement, part of a journal called Common Ground, like just the work that I've done that I think does kind of go back to this kind of utopic worlds from the 60s and 70s. Then finally getting to move to South Africa and kind of recognizing, the possibilities of how we need to address gender-based violence. For a while, I directed a project, a very large project funded by Global Affairs Canada on educational leadership. And I immediately saw, like, women aren't in leadership positions. Men are in leadership positions. Who's determining the policies? And schools then as now, and maybe not unlike our schools, full of gender-based violence. How can you look at gender? How can you look at leadership if you don't bring this work around gender along? So I guess I've had many opportunities to work with different ministries, because once I was in the middle of that experience of looking at gender and leadership and the kinds of safety issues and so on, I think they have just led from one project to another. And certainly the participatory work supporting that comes out of the work that I have done around HIV and AIDS in Southern Africa, recognizing that many of the youth that I was meeting in 2000 and 2001 were saying things like, we're just sick of AIDS. And they really meant they were sick of AIDS. They were very sick, but they were also sick of hearing about it. But once we were doing, like, arts-based work, and once we were doing making and creating and dialogue, just seeing, like, what a difference that made to how people thought about their everyday lives. So I guess those kinds of experiences have been really, really critical in what I'm doing today.
It's a good thing that you were alert to these issues, because I'm assuming that a lot of other female academics, maybe who are also doing research, probably would not have had the motivation or the courage or to do what you just talked about.
Well, yeah, there are a lot. There are a lot of us. But I do agree that, like, not everybody takes up gender, and I'm notorious for saying at a doctoral defense, okay, but what's gender got to do with it? And pretty soon there's going to be an answer to that for everybody in whatever topic I think that you take up. But I was also surrounded by other feminists. I mean, I kind of travel in feminist communities. One of the first international projects I did was in Zambia, when women were preparing for the Beijing conference in 1995. And I didn't go to it, but I actually met women. I worked with women in Zambia who were talking about being the first woman in their community to ever go to university. And so like, I just kind of meeting many women along the way, academics and communities, and like kind of grassroots organizations where this work has been taking place for a long time. So I guess I was fortunate. I landed into that group, or I found that group, and I continue to look for groups and people who are interested in these issues.
What were the main challenges you think you faced over the years?
I think one of the challenges is providing support to women to do work in gender, knowing that if they didn't do work in gender, their careers would probably progress faster. Like, so many, from about like the mid-90s on, many governments came up with some sort of gender machinery of like gender focal persons and gender policy people and so on. And that's kind of where I landed in a lot of the work that I've done in South Africa and Ethiopia and various countries. And I know that probably most women would, if they were not doing gender, they would, if they're a scientist and they just simply went and did their scientific work, they probably would have progressed faster in some ways. But they were also committed to like bringing this lens of gender to what they're doing and really understanding the inequalities and so on. So I think it's a challenge. Like I feel like sometimes I just don't like if we were doing literacy, which is where I started my doctoral work in literacy. It doesn't have this, and it does have a political side to it. So I don't want to say it doesn't have a political side to it, because of course it does. But I know that if these women that I'm supporting just said, I'm going to do reading, they wouldn't have encountered as many opponents in their work. And that is a challenge to me, like how to build a support system that says it's going to be rocky and bumpy and full of hiccups, but how to build solidarity to do that, because it is a difficult thing.
I think what you just expressed in terms of the challenge regarding doing work on gender and the idea of progress, I think that's what I was trying to ask earlier about alertness, but you worded it much better than I did. Well. All right, let's talk history.
Okay, wow.
So I do a lot of work on how people use history in their everyday lives. So some of these questions emerge from the book, Historical Consciousness and Practical Life, A Theory and Methodology. So the first question I'd like to ask is, what's the first idea or image that comes to mind when you think of history? And why do you think that image comes to mind?
Oh, well, the first image, I guess, in some ways it's a very negative image, because my history of history in school is like hating history, and also being surrounded by World War, like the histories of World War I and World War II. My entire family of aunts and uncles and grandparents, and having my parents try to drag me to Armistice Day and Remembrance Day services, and thinking, like, why would I want to celebrate war? Like, you're just going to celebrate war. And being so terribly antagonistic, like just a horrible human being that I was at the age of 12 or 13 or 14. And they were kind of like just horrible images that to me seemed like celebratory and irrelevant to my life. So I don't know if that's an image or just, a set of words about what I felt about history when I could have been becoming very interested in history. As a feminist, history is fascinating. Once I started thinking about like the history of women and the history of my mother's history, my grandmother's history, and not my grandfather's history, and not my father's history, but thinking of the mothers and thinking of history in a different sense. And the early days of Ms. Magazine and all of that work was really to hang on to women's histories and recognizing that there is a whole body of work on women's histories. And now there's a researcher from the UK called Jane Miller, who taught for many years at the Institute of Education, kind of literacy, feminism, culture. She actually came to McGill in about, I guess, sometime probably in the late 1990s, and ran a summer institute. But she has a line about, we are all in history and with a history. And that was kind of like a different way of thinking about me in history and with a history, and thinking of this in the context of feminism and why we need to hang on to the history of 1995 and Beijing. And after that, I met a group of women from Russia who told me they had taken the train from St. Petersburg to Beijing to attend that conference, and how they'd hung they were on the train, the
Siberian
Express, yes. And how they hung their lingerie on the back of it to dry while because they were on the train for so many, I think it was like 6 days or something like that. So they had to do some laundry along the way, and like how the train personnel didn't know that they were hanging their clothes outside at the back and so on. It's like, and that's what they were going to. They were going to Beijing, and they were like, their voices were there. Like, it was like such an amazing thing in 1995 to do that. So I think it's just kind of like recognizing the significance of history. I'm working with my colleague Rebekah Molatsani from Wits University, the University of the Witwatersrand, and we're looking at kind of like a feminist history of gender in South Africa from the mid-1990s, which is, like, I know it's not deep history for some, and it definitely gets me out of those world wars. But there is like a really significant history of the last like 40 some years of, post-apartheid, trying to think through like what policies came in, how did we experience them. I was never interested in archival work, and then suddenly I was, because I realized I'm sitting on the archives in my office of like meeting up with the first people who were setting up this gender machinery that I referred to, much of which, I guess thankfully has been lost, but some of it has been replaced. Some of it hasn't, and that's an unfortunate kind of thing. But like trying to think through, like, what were people thinking in 1994 and 1995 that you'd start a whole new country with a whole new, like a completely new education system and a completely new health system. These are things that are like totally radical to a Canadian context, but that you could start up and do a new set of structures, and that I could be part of starting up a new set of structures. And then, like, where has that taken us? And that's where your earlier questions of like referring to the 1 step forward and 2 steps back, but we never went back to apartheid, or like, where did we go from that? And how are my colleagues thinking about work now in terms of women in leadership? So there's those kinds of histories to me are really important. And I think that's kind of a recognizing that that's history is like radical to me, I guess, from my beginnings of, I hate World War II and I hate World War I, and I don't want to hear anything more about it, and no, I'm not going to any event on November the 11th.
I appreciate how you've moved from history that is irrelevant to recognizing your own historicity and your own ability to be history and to help make change. So the first image that comes to mind is World War I, World War II, the irrelevant dates and events. Now, what's your earliest memory of your connection to history? So we talked about the first image, but your first memory of your connection to history?
Probably through photographs. My family, both my father and mother come from colonial stock. They're both sets of grandparents came from the UK, settlers, doing who knows what, but kind of recognizing that they brought such a rich history with them, and the photographs that go back and forth. My mother was not well educated, but she was a great. You would appreciate her preservationist tendencies on photographs and being kind of the archivist in the family. So I guess that has been a really important part of my historicity, and I'm actually working on a project right now where we're kind of we've been doing some reenactments of family photographs in York. I did some travel with my 3 daughters 2 years ago, and we're actually now having an exhibition at York St. John University later this year, where we've done some reenactments of photos from England that were taken in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, and we went back and found the places and reenacted them, and we've had some interesting discussions there. We also have these the myths in families that are historically interesting. Like, at some point, the story started that my grandmother was booked to come to Canada on the Titanic. And her husband was already in Manitoba, working on the railway, and of course, she didn't take the Titanic, but the story was that she got to Southampton from York, and when she got there, there was a telegram saying that her mother was sick, and she had to go back. So she went back, and she never got on the Titanic.
Wow.
And then there's these stories that one of my late aunts would say, when your grandfather heard that, it took like 10 men to keep him throwing him into the Halifax harbor or something like that, because he thought she was on the Titanic.
Oh my.
Now these are not even remotely possible. It turns out she actually left. We've been doing some historical tracings, and she actually came on another boat that left from Liverpool, not Southampton, on the same day, and not the speedy Titanic that whipped into the icebergs, but like a slow boat to St. John. So but these stories are in our family, and so we're trying to figure out how to depict this in an exhibition, because we obviously don't have any photographs of my grandmother on the Titanic, and since she wasn't on the Titanic, but we have how to represent family story. And I've been studying the work of Wang Tui, who is a Chinese he's a Chinese, what I would say, video installation artist. And he currently has he's part of an exhibition at the Canadian Centre for Architecture right now, where he's done all sorts of reenactments in China of in contemporary times, but looking at the 1940s. So we're kind of looking at, could we do something like this? Who are we going to? We might hire you to. We need somebody to play my grandfather throwing himself into the harbor or something. But the reenactment piece is another part of this, and maybe using video installation as another component.
Wow.
Yeah. Yes. So I guess it's like my family photographs have just I've become so absorbed.
But what
by
is
them.
it that triggered this passion in you and this motivation to put time and effort into creating something beautiful? I'm assuming it's going to be beautiful.
Well, I hope so. I think my children have helped this, because they're so curious. Because my mother died quite a number of years ago, and there actually isn't I'm the main person. I have a nephew who's also passionate about this work, but I kind of recognize that there aren't a lot of other people in the family who even know the little that I know. So we just started working on piecing sections together. One of my daughters I feel like she's a stalker, really. She can find anything. She's an art historian, but if you want somebody to track down people, so it's been kind of like a really beautiful family project.
Wow.
of kind of figuring out what to do with this, and why would we, and I never imagined that we were ever going to have an exhibition, but I met some people who are really interested in visual ethics at the University of York St. John's. And so there's kind of an ethical piece to this. How do you ethically engage with history? How do you ethically engage with these photographs? I mean, we have these wild stories that we tell, and then we realize they're not even true. But is it my aunt why did she start that? Or how did I get into that? So there's kind of an ethical piece to this, and these reenactments. How ethical is it to do family reenactments? Everybody's dead, but what do we have the right to do? And where is there kind of a family complicitness, or is there a kind of consent in this work? So it makes me realize that everybody who works in this field obviously has to kind of engage in this kind of ethical stance of how do you interpret history, and it's even more a kind of level of responsibility when you're doing it in your own family, in your own photographs. So I think that's where how I've come to engage in this work. And of course it has lots of feminist questions. One of the other pieces that we're working with is a whole series of photographs from one woman who was a pen pal of my mother in the 1940s. And this woman put her name into a box of milk filters. My mother was working on a dairy farm, and this it's like putting your name in a bottle. My mother opens up this carton of milk filters and says, "Here's this woman. I won't mention her name on this, so that just in case I am anything, any libelous things. Says, write to me." So my mother and this woman had a correspondence for years. And the only thing we have now are we have about 50 photographs that this woman sent to my mother. And we assume my mother sent photographs to her. But recently, when my daughters and I went to the UK, we actually tracked down her son, who briefly was a pen friend of mine when we were 11. And I just, like my stalking daughter, found him. I won't mention her name, but she found him, and I just wrote him a letter, and I sent him a few pictures of his mother so she wouldn't think that I was like a crown prince from an exotic country stalking him, saying, "Oh, here I am, Claudia Skinner," and whatever. And so he wrote back immediately.
Oh, wow.
I gave him my email address. Immediately said, "Oh, Claudia Skinner, box 583 Verdun," and knew my box number. And so we've established a relationship. But they're also part of this exhibition because we've got all these photographs of his mother, of him and his family and so on. But then we have parallel photographs that my mother took, because that's also the genre of photographs from the 1940s is really cool. They're all kind of like these stock black and white photographs, very glamorous by people who don't necessarily live glamorous lives, but they have glamorous photos, and and the captions on the back of these photographs. So we're kind of working with those as the third piece of this exhibition. So it has both like my family, but now how do you engage somebody else's family in this work? And so far they like me, and we're getting along. They're lovely people. I visited them twice, and they actually like hearing from this pen friend from so many years ago became like a story in rural Yorkshire. So like I'm a little bit of a celebrity when I go there now, because I'm this mythical person from the colonies. It was quite lovely. Yeah.
History is a lot of fun then.
History is so much fun.
It's not
absolutely.
Irrelevant.
No. Once we got over the wars, we were like, and I feel like my daughters are really excited about this. I have 2 grandsons, and one of them in particular is like, he's kind of keen on this as well. So
Beautiful project.
It's kind of an interesting project.
Wow. Very impressive. I hope you invite me to your exhibition.
I think everybody at McGill is going to have to come.
We'll be there.
Yes, great.
So could you describe a moment in time or an episode or an incident in your professional life or in your everyday life where you had to justify the importance of using history for making change or for attaining a goal? Did you ever have to justify the use of history for making change through your work or through your daily life?
I think universities are full of history, and I've been in our department for quite a few years, and the number of times that something comes up. So I mean I can think of like maybe some more interesting political examples in terms of feminist research or whatever, but I can think like in the everyday life of our work in the department, how many times people say, "Oh, we should do that," and part of me wants to think, we already did that. So I hate people who, "Oh, well, we already did that." So it's like trying to think through, like, how can you bring this into a conversation in a way that suggests we did try it once and maybe we could do it again, but let's remember that when we did it that time, this is what happened. And I have a couple of other colleagues in the department who have probably been there as long as I have or longer. And it's kind of like the eye contact across a room for this historic moment. These could be like those Canadian history memories or something like that. So I think like just like the structures, we often are discussing something around faculty council or whatever, and kind of recognizing, oh, this is how that used to work, and actually it did work really well. We just are not doing that now or something. So I don't know if I can say definitively there was something that I brought up, but there is kind of like a social solidarity with others who are in a similar in this institution, and how we try to bring those in subtle ways or whatever. And I think that maybe is an important part of, like they're not necessarily disputes, but they're kind of a recognition that new people come along and probably have way better ideas, but that there are sometimes things that are like, oh, it's not like we've never tried that, or that this place has never had any history of what that might look like. I don't know if that's enough, but like that's the kind of
So
thing.
it provides a bit of context in a way. History provides context in that sense.
Yeah, and again, these are not necessarily the like deep or extreme histories of the Punic Wars or something like that, but they are, the history.
But it is history.
The history of a faculty that is whatever, like I forget how old we are. We've some years, like 60 or 70 years or whatever. So no, it can't be that old. Well, I'm not a reliable historian on how old the faculty even is, but definitely thinking of some of the policies we might have passed, or some of the regulatory things we might have had like 35 years ago, how they might have changed, I think is part of that.
So history could provide better guidance if people were more alert to it, or
yes, and I think it's hard for people to write histories of departments and faculties. They often end up in kind of like these little glorified, I don't know, we did this and then we did this.
Minutes.
But not really something that's engaging. The one person I can say who has contributed greatly to the history of McGill on that is Margaret Gillette, the late Margaret Gillette, who was part of our faculty, and I think she I think really embraced women's histories and a feminist history of McGill, and feminist history of McGill in terms of who can go into the faculty club, or who can be a doctor, who can be the first woman Maud Abbott as a in the faculty of medicine and so on. That kind of documentation I think is really important, and like maybe at some point I will be able to contribute to that in some way.
Wow. So you just gave great examples of how history can work, can help guide us, can provide context. And maybe the answer is obvious, but maybe it's not. But why do we forget, or why do we not bother? Like, what is it about us as humans, or as people in a working environment that we are not ignorant, but not aware of all this hard work that's been done prior to us?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I think we get caught up in the everyday of things. I think sometimes it's a luxury to think, to work historically, or to use memory. Maybe we don't have enough examples of, like, we have all of the deans of education, their photographs in a hallway somewhere, but we don't have many other photographs or images or artwork. I'm just thinking just of the faculty of education, like not thinking of the rest of McGill or whatever. But we often don't like celebrate historical pieces, or, and I know there's a mural that keeps moving around until eventually it's going to be in the basement, even though it was probably something that was very important, but there's no caption on it. There's no, there's no curatorial statement in, like, we don't, like, you could walk through our faculty and have no sense of history whatsoever. And yet, the building itself it's not my favorite building, but there are family members that I have who think this is a beautiful brutalist piece, but it's just never been looked after properly. Like, it'll have a photocopy machine in front of a window, like, when it should be a plant or nothing. Like, there's no attention to the history, or very little attention to the history of the building. And nobody knows about the history of the building. I think we had a discussion, we had some sort of an event about it, maybe 15 years ago. But, like, where are we? Why are we here? Why are we in this place? What does it mean? Like, I think we could have more money, I guess, that when we're building things or when we're creating things, that has a little bit more attention to the detail of what this is. So, I mean, that doesn't really answer your question fully, but it's an attempt to think through that we do need to be, like, intentional about history and intentional about things. And whenever you do start reflecting on something that has this memory piece or whatever, you think, oh yeah, like, how would you show that, or how could you build that in some way? So I think our buildings could be more historical. historically conscious. Oh, there. Historically conscious. That's for you, Paul. So they could be more historically conscious, and maybe we could just like build it in more, even in our scholarship and so on. Like for doctoral students coming along, how do we build that? How do they build in the history of the question in a more intentional way, maybe in the thesis? And I'll just go back to the wonderful Jane Miller again. She wrote a whole article on the autobiography of a question as a piece that we should always be looking at when we're coming to a new question. Where did it start? How did it get nurtured, and how is it right now? And that is a little bit of a living historically in our scholarship as well.
Very interesting. So whenever we are aware that we are doing something that will have an impact on people's lives in the future, in the near future, and when that involves a form of intentionality, we should find a way to curate it for the future.
Yes.
Is that what you're trying?
Yeah, I think so.
That's so interesting. I like that.
I think the word "trying" is the operative one there, because it's like we go from one research project to the next, and like we don't necessarily have the space or the time, or we take the time to actually build something in a more intentionally thoughtful, considerate way. And yet it's so exciting. History is fun. And to kind of think through, where did this come from? And like, why are we doing this now?
So we're going to go back to definitions again.
Okay.
And I don't know if you like definitions or not, but based on what you've said, so history could be irrelevant, but then you recognize your historicity and then your ability to contribute to history. And then you talked about how history can help guide us, history can provide context, and the whole notion of intentionality. Based on what you've said, how would you define history? What do you think history is? What does it serve to do?
I think it serves to locate us. I think it's part of identity. I think we talk, something that's so significant to feminist research is positionality. And yet, and not just in feminist research, but I think in research that has a social meaning to it, that we position ourselves. So I think that's maybe positioning and situating and understanding those two words is something that kind of helps us put our own identities into our work.
Very interesting. So it's also being aware and accountable.
Yeah, absolutely.
For our presence and movement in time, maybe.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
I'm not putting words in your mouth.
No. But I like that, because I think that it is that, like, how do we account for? We're sitting in this office in this building, which is a historically significant moment to move away from the hill down to Sherbrooke. But people say, "Oh, is that has the Faculty of Education moved?" No, but some people have moved. And how are we? How are we thinking about where we are right now?
Your understanding of history is very similar to my understanding of history.
Well, I think that's why I loved your book.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, no, I think that
it's like position taking.
Yes, and like the everyday, like.
Yeah.
I know you're very philosophical about it, and that's beautiful. So I don't mean that as but it still is in the everydayness that I love this.
Yes. So what you just described about what history is and what it does that really or mostly happen at an individual level, or do you think it could also happen at a collective level?
Oh, well, you asked the wrong person that, because since I am committed to collaborative research and participatory methodologies and feminist solidarity and collectivity, I think of course people experience these things at an individual level as well, but I think the kind of social constructions of history are really, really important. And I think that's a piece of what I'm enjoying with my daughters right now. The project that I told you about wouldn't be nearly as fascinating if I weren't working with other people on it. And I think seeing how other people embrace the similar histories. But and of course, in my kind of as a feminist, I think there are so many different forms of feminism, so I don't want to be sort of monolithic about this, but I think trying to think through these questions as in groups and as a collective. I come from the collective collectivity and consciousness raising of the 70s. That these were like really important pieces of kind of like the social concept.
So this idea of being aware of your historicity and making history and seeing history as a form of or as a guiding light,
Yes.
for example, or intentionality, cannot necessarily happen on one's own. It's instinctively or inherently a part of a group.
It is for me. I mean,
Yes.
I don't know. It's hard to kind of
Yes.
proclaim for all people.
Yes, but I'm interested in what you
yeah,
think.
for me, I think it is. I think it is a social piece.
Okay, yeah,
And
fascinating.
It's
I love
everything
it.
from well, again, back to girlhood studies. That like the kind of like the collectivity of girls' experiences, women's experiences, experiences in families, experiences of being a settler. Experiences, like I think these kinds of identities are also part of like when I talk to other people who have similar interests and similar background, I think that there's this kind of, I think there is kind of a shared history that is important.
I really find that interesting. It's very insightful. Thank you for that, Claudia. My next question is, I usually ask, is history the way you just described it? Is it a bad thing or a good thing? But I'm wondering, what are the pros or cons of what you described as history? When you're doing history as part of a group, inevitably as part of a group, is there a downside to that? Could there be a downside? Or is it always something that is positive or good?
Good question. I think it could be. There could be a downside. I mean, I think we have many examples in history of collective history being very bad. So I'm not sure. I don't want to lump myself into these categories of bad people, but maybe I am.
Why would you be bad?
No. But I think we've seen many examples of group consciousness and group thinking that could be very harmful. And maybe we think about the ways in which race, class, gender intersect, that they're without that kind of an intersectional thinking about work, we might fall into traps of being very monolithic on how we think about something. So I think there could be a downside.
What is it that leads to, you talked about group consciousness earlier just now.
Yeah.
Is there an explanation for how things can go south or fall into a trap like you just mentioned?
Maybe we take too many things for granted. We like one of the interesting projects that I've been involved in over the years is on collective memory work, drawing on the work of Frigga Haug, the German Marxist theorist, and this is like women coming together and writing down, usually in the third person, memories of like a body part or first memory of maybe violence or something like that. And what Frigga Haug came up with her colleagues is like ways to kind of like speak back or interrogate memory. Like whose stories are missing? We're sitting around, there are 10 of us sitting in this room doing this work, but who's not here? So we think, oh yes, that story that's exactly what happened to me. But we just have to have one more person in the room who doesn't have that experience with the confidence to speak up and say, hey, wait a minute, that's not my story. That's not my history. What about this particular piece? So I think that like trying to imagine what structures we need in place to interrogate collective memory is a really important part of this. And why do we remember things the way we remember them? But how could we also contest memory? And it wasn't exactly like that, but that's kind of like that's the collective way you should think about it, kind of thing. And I don't know that. I think we spend a lot of our lives being somewhat unconscious, and it's only when we're pushed to kind of question something, or a new person comes along and says, why do you do it that way? Or that's not like last night in one of my classes, well, the only class I taught last night. I can't teach two classes at once in one night. But in that class, people were talking about how we come to know sexuality. Critical and ethical perspectives on sexuality education. And so almost everyone in the room is about the same age and same everything. But we have a new student who joined us last night from China, and he was talking about how his memory of that everybody was talking about high schools and what sexuality is, how it's represented in movies and so on in high school. And the student was saying, in schools in China where I went, none of the toilets have doors on them. It's only after you leave school that you would have these opportunities, that you would be in toilets without doors. And people were like, they found that fascinating. And they were like, but also, what? Like, you have to have a door. Like, it was just like, but just taking this one story, it kind of disrupted a little bit of Gossip Girls and Mean Girl and all of the other pieces that most people had shared as a common, experience of being 12 or 13 or 14. And like that was so important, because we could have carried on the whole evening, and whether toilets or have doors or not would never come up. And we would never interrogate washrooms in quite the same way as having just this one dissenting voice or a different story to add to that. And I think that I'm not sure if I've lost the plot of your question
now. Not at all.
now.
I love it. It's like a clue.
But this really took us into, I think, kind of a recognition of, why, not why diversity is so important, but why we need so many stories.
Yes.
And we need to be, and a space to tell them. And somebody who feels confident enough, or a space where that person felt confident enough to say, I can't talk about Mean Girls, but I can talk about this. And this is the popular culture that I experienced in China, and it's different. And like everybody learned so much from that one moment.
It's like a clue that permits us to see things differently.
Yeah, absolutely.
When I'm listening to you, I'm thinking also about the concept of reflexivity, and I'm sure it factors quite a bit in the work you do. Did you have some thoughts on reflexivity?
Well, of course I do. Let me reflect on that. But I think it's a really key part of feminist research: positionality, intersectionality, and reflexivity,
and history.
The big four. And of course, in my work as a teacher educator, I've regarded I'm the sort of like the Donald Schoen groupie of reflexivity and the reflective practitioner kind of work. And I was like, that was very exciting to come into that world and kind of recognize that as being a really significant part of becoming a teacher. And I think I kept journals as a beginning teacher in rural Nova Scotia for years and years and years. I didn't know anything about reflexivity, but journal writing and the idea of writing things down and thinking about them on paper, and not that reflexivity is only about keeping a journal, but like as one strategy in that work and how important that is. So yeah, I think it's absolutely critical. And I don't know how I guess you do. Could you have historical consciousness without reflexivity? Or maybe I guess it depends on who's doing it and what people are doing. But I mean, I would take it as a really critical part of the work.
Mm-hmm. Yes, you could have a form of awareness of the past without being reflexive at all.
Yeah,
for sure. Are there any final thoughts you'd like to share about history or about feminism or about the work you do that you weren't able to mention earlier?
Well, there is one piece. I'd forgotten that I was one of the pieces of the partnership grant that I'm directing right now, called Transform: Engaging with Young People for Social Change, which was part of where that exhibition came out of. We have built a piece of history into that. We have a number of different scholars who are interested in the feminist history. Our colleague Nanre is interested in feminist history in Nigeria.
Nanre Nafziger.
Nafziger, yes. We have, thank you for putting, we also have in South Africa, we have a group of young women who are now they're in their early 30s, but they first started working on a project, a previous partnership grant in 2005 2013 when they were just starting university. They're now teachers. And they are involved in like studying their own history of transformation from 2013 to 2026. I wrote a book a couple of years ago with Shannon Walsh called In My Life, Youth Activists in South Africa, 2001 to 2021. So it was a 20-year history of working with the same young people and having them reflect, meeting with them every year and having them reflect on what they were learning and how they were changing in terms of their thoughts about being AIDS activists and activists more generally. So those are pieces that I think we can build this work into our own contemporary projects as being a critical part of the work. And I think that we're hoping to have some sort of a conference just on methodologies that would allow us to do this kind of longitudinal work in different ways. And I would love to involve you in this as well, because I think this is a really, like, the methods for doing this. And Nan Ray has particular interest. She's just written an article for a journal called Agenda on her work in Nigeria. And we have others who are looking at these notions of it's like I guess it's everyday life history, but history over a period of time.
Yes.
Kind of think through what does activism look like over a 20-year period. Nan Ray has also been working with a group of young people to make cell films with gender activists from 15 or 20 years ago, and how is that history being maintained, and what are we learning from it? So I just wanted to put that out there as well.
Fascinating work. Claudia Michell, thank you so much. I had a lot of fun.
Oh, I did too. That was great.
I'll see you soon. Thank you so much.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.